On today's Locked On Jayhawks, how deep into the rotation can we expect Bill Self to go with this year's Jayhawks?
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I'm Derek Johnson. You can give me a follow on Twitter at DJohnsonRadio, and you can find our show. It's called Locked On Jayhawks anywhere you get your podcast, including on our YouTube page where you can like and subscribe to the show. And on today's edition of LOJ, we're talking how deep can Bill Self take this roster? How deep will the rotation go? Because typically there are some trends about how not very deep the rotation ends up going. On paper, it's always easy in the offseason to discuss getting to maybe a bit of a wider rotation and all these guys that could be in competition. Or there may be some past historical data elements, which we're going to kind of take a look at, that give us an idea of how deep it could go or how deep typically it goes. So we'll get into all that on today's episode of the show, which is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Make every moment more as playoffs wind down. The sports stop sporting like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. All right. So how deep will Bill Self go into the rotation? And you look at, this KU roster, and I think it's very easy to, convince yourself that it can be 9 guys deep, right? You think about whatever your starting 5 projection is going to be. You think about the guys that are on the bench. I mean, I think it's pretty clear to me. Dajuan Harris, Zeke Mayo, Rylan Griffen, AJ Storr, KJ Adams, Hunter Dickinson, and then whoever your backup center ends up being, that's 7 spots right there. And that doesn't even get into, okay, what if you play, multiple backup centers? What if Flory Bidunga plays and Zach Clemence plays, where maybe Clemence is playing some minutes at the 5 and the 4, right? And that would be an 8th guy. What about Shakeel Moore, who they added in to bring in another ball handler and as a good defender? Okay, that would be a 9th guy. What about Rakease Passmore, who certainly seems to be somebody who could be even better than their recruiting ranking might end up? Then all of a sudden you have 10 guys, right? So you can easily convince yourself, and maybe you're fine knocking one of those guys out. It's still 9 guys. How often does Bill Self even go 9 guys deep? It's not as much as you might think. So I actually have a little chart that I came up with here. I don't know how well this is going to come across on our YouTube, but we'll try to describe for our audio listeners as well. And it basically shows how deep into the rotation that Bill Self teams have gone each and every year at Kansas. So what you're looking at here is there are different ways that you can view the rotation, right? There are different ways in terms of, are you a rotation player? Like, are you an everyday rotation player by total minutes played? Because that indicates that you played a lot of minutes each and every game. Do you view it by games played, where it was like, okay, you were consistently, if you played all 40 games, even if it was only 5 minutes per game, you were consistently in the rotation? Or do you view it by minutes per game, meaning that like, yeah, but 5 minutes per game, that's nothing. You got to be playing at least, 8 minutes per game or 10 minutes per game, right? There are different ways that you can look at this. And then there's also the rotations of the difference between the regular season versus the difference of rotations in the postseason when things whittle down a little bit more. So we'll get into kind of that conversation. But when you look at it, so we have this separated out of total minutes. If you were to look at the rotation as total minutes by 3% or more of the total minutes available, then you can find some years where KU played, a decent amount of years where KU played 9 or more guys. And even a couple of years, you look at 2019, you look at 2015, 2011, where they played 10 deep. And in the cases of those, 2011, that was just an ultra deep team that had a lot of good players. Then you have the cases of 2015 and 2019, where it was more so just kind of throwing stuff at the wall and having maybe a lot of decent options, but not knowing which one is best. But on average, if you're looking at 3% plus of the minutes, you're talking about the average being almost a 9-man rotation, 8.7 guys. So it's actually closer to being a 9-man rotation if that's how you want to view it. Now, if you're wondering like how many minutes is that exactly, if we just viewed it as like, let's say you did play all 40 games, you're winning the national championship, then, and let's say that none of the games go to overtime just for sake of this. There's 200 minutes to be given out per game times 40 games. That's 8,000 minutes. And if you're multiplying that by 3%, I hope this math is making sense for you. That is 240 minutes played for a player, which divided by 40 games again, they might have only played 30 or something like that. But if they played all 40, it would be 6 minutes per game, right? So that's kind of where you're at. That's not like a hefty number to get to. If we raise that number to 4%, though, you see these drop down. It goes from on average an 8.7 man rotation to an average of an 8.1 man rotation under Bill Self. But still, there are some years where 2019, 2015, where it was a 10 man rotation, but still some years worth a 7 man rotation, including most recently, the last 3 years, it would all be a 7 man rotation. Now, I don't know if that's something of a trend for Bill Self or if that's just how it's kind of gone. I think I lean that way. I don't think Bill Self would, prefer to have a less deep team. You know what I mean? He's talked about before, like using the bench as kind of a motivation tool and a teaching tool in a way. So what if we go up to 5% or more of the minutes? Then you end up with a rotation around 7.6. So more realistically, if you're talking about guys to just be playing, right, the 6 minute per game mark, which maybe that does apply to talking about a third center if you're KU, right? I talked about the rotation. Hunter Dickinson's your starter. You'll have a backup center, and then you'll have your third center. Your third center might qualify into the first pool where it's like, yeah, maybe they're playing 6 minutes per game or something like that, or 8 minutes per game, but not every game. But they're not really fully part of the rotation. Maybe that's one that you could kind of chop it off, and that would get you down to 9, which even the 5% plus of minutes, there are some situations of 9, which was, 2019, 2015, again, 2011, which was a loaded team, 2006, went 9 kind of across the board there. But overall, more often it's 7 to 8 men who are playing this many, which is closer to like 10 minutes per game. Now, if we look at the games played, so this one could be a little skewed because you have certain guys who are injured, but if you view that more as being a part of the rotation, then the guys who played 80% or more of the games, that is about an 8.3 man rotation. What about 90% or more of the games? That's only a 7.4 man rotation. And what about guys who played 95% plus of the games? On average, 6.8 under Bill Self. So it's even less than a 7 man rotation. And there are times where it was only 6 guys did that. Again, some of that can be deterred by injury, but the amount of times that like Bill Self has never had a team where 9 or more guys have played 95% plus of the games. And I think that might be the most telling of all, because in a specific game, it's going to tend to be 8 guys. Now, it might be a different 8th guy in 1 week, and then a couple weeks down the road, it's a different 8th guy. But for the most part, it ends up being 8 guys. And I think that's kind of the story that tells us. Then you move over to the minutes per game column. So guys who played 8+ minutes per game, that one ends up being around 9. So if you're viewing just to be a rotation player playing 8 minutes per game, and again, I said you could easily get yourself to 9 or 10 guys being a part of that as part of this year's roster. Well, okay, you could say, okay, we can have 9 guys who play 8+ minutes per game when we're constructing this, and that would make sense. Maybe they just don't play each and every game. So there's that part of it. Then the 10+ minutes per game part is a little bit shorter, but it's still 8.1, which is maybe more than I thought, and still some circumstances of 10 guys, 2019, 2015, and 2011. And then you go back to 2006 as well. That one's on there too. So those are kind of the deep years for you. What about 12+ minutes per game? Then you end up with a rotation closer to 7.5. But I was surprised by this. There are a decent amount of years where, so you look at 2006, you look at 2011, you look at 2015, where they played 9 guys or more 12+ minutes per game. Now, those seasons, 2011 was a great year. And again, that's because you were so loaded with NBA talent, which maybe that's a conversation for this year's team. How many guys do they have who are realistic, like NBA draft picks right now? I don't know. It's not nearly as much as 2011, I would say. But some of those other years, it was more just based on trying to figure out what your rotation would be. And then you get to the NCAA tournament, which kind of tells a different story about, or maybe more of a same story, but that, again, it just kind of gets whittled down. So what does this all mean for deciding what this year's rotation is going to have, how deep Bill Self will go in it? Let's draw some conclusions on the other side with this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. First, we are brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. I love sports. I love them so much, and I think you probably do too. I never want them to stop, but as the playoffs wind down, we get fewer games, and the sports aren't sportsing like you want them to. But FanDuel lets you keep the sports going whenever you want, all you have to do is open the app, dream up bets anytime you're in the mood. And I still think there's a ton going on right now. I get into golf tournaments each and every weekend. We got the Open coming up here in a few weeks. So you got that going on right now. You still got WNBA going on. You want to get some Caitlin Clark going. Royals killing it right now in the MLB. You can get in on some of that. And there's all the preseason futures, win total over-unders, who's going to win the conference, who's going to win the Heisman, who's going to win the Super Bowl. And this summer, FanDuel's hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball and of the Locked On Podcast Network. Continuing on, how deep will Bill Self go into the rotation on this episode of Locked On Jayhawks? Well, there's a couple ways to look at things based on kind of the chart that we put together there. So for the most part, it was between on the total minutes, depending which of the categories you wanted to go into for how strict or how loose you wanted to be, between 7.5 and almost 9 guys. For the games played, it was between about 7 to 8.5. For minutes per game, it was between 7.5 and 9. So that gets us in the range. We're talking 7.5 to 9. I think if you think the depth is going to be good on this year's team, you can get to a 9-man rotation, because there are evidence of teams that did a 9-man rotation, right? And again, it depends what bucket you want to look at here. But like if we took the total minutes 4+%, you would have the 2019 team, the 2016 team, the 2011 team, the 2008 team, the 2006 team, right? So you can get to that point, but that 9th guy's probably not playing like a ton of minutes. Might end up being like 8 minutes per game. And if you think the depth on this year's team is going to be good, which I just talked about some of those guys that you can get to, and we'll finish up here with the dangers of the offseason and how sometimes we overdo it a bit in the offseason. So we'll finish up with that. But you can clearly get yourself to that point. And if they do end up being deep, then yeah, I think they can play a 9-man rotation. I don't think it'll be as high as 10. I think 9 is kind of the ceiling I'd go, but that is dependent on the players having to earn that trust and earn that favor and earn those minutes with Bill Self here in the offseason. I think if you end up having average depth, it'll be 8 guys. And when I say average depth, basically you have your starting 5. You'll have one guy that maybe is getting like 20+ minutes per game off the bench as a true 6th man. Then you'll have like a 7th guy who's maybe giving you 10 to 15, and then you'll have your backup center. Like that would be your 8-man rotation, I think, with average depth. And that would mean that a couple guys, weren't really playing. And then if they end up being thin, I mean, there's a chance you could be 7 guys and in bigger games down to just 6 guys. Like that is not that unthinkable here for this team. I know it's easy to go through all this. And again, we'll talk about more of this later, but what happens if this player you thought was going to be good just doesn't translate right away, or takes, this freshman more time. And then all of a sudden you end up with a situation closer to last year than you might have hoped, because again, last year going into the year, there was thought that, okay, Arterio Morris is going to play a lot of minutes and Nick Timberlake's going to be the perfect 3-point shooter for this team. And Elmarko coming in as a McDowell All-American. And then all of a sudden you end up with not a ton of winning production out of what you kind of got there, right? So you never really know until it all comes together. But yeah, I mean, that's the real answer. It could be 7 to 9 guys, depending on what impresses. Based on what I'm going to project right now, I would have it being 9 guys, because I am a little bit confident in getting what you need out of these guys. But I do feel like I'm taking a leap in doing that, because if we're really going back and looking at it and saying, guys who are playing 8+ minutes per game, basically, I mean, it's just 8+ minutes per game and 80% plus of the games. When you're looking at 9+ man rotations, you're talking 2022, you're talking 2016, 2014. I mean, that's 3 times in the last decade, So it doesn't happen that often, but at least there is some evidence of it happening, at least to a certain degree. Then the question becomes, is Kansas deep or not? Because again, literally every offseason we talk about how deep they are, because you see the flash and the potential of every single player, every single name that's up there. And I think sometimes we do confuse, and I've been a victim of this too, or a culprit of this, I guess, confusing depth with names. This can happen for any sport. Sometimes it's, oh, wow, they have that guy and that guy and that guy coming off the bench. And it's just like, because it's a name. Or it's like a lineup in the MLB, and it's like, wow, that guy's hitting 7th and that guy's hitting 8th. Just because it's a name we recognize, but the player is no longer good. Like they're out of their prime, or they're declining, or they're playing through injury or something. They're not good that year, but we recognize the name, so we give it more credit than for what it is. And I think sometimes that can be the case with transfer portal and McDonald's All-Americans and stuff like that. But in reality, it doesn't always add up. So while I think on paper that this team should be deeper than last year, and my official answer would be 8 to 9 deep, leaning toward 9 deep in the regular season and getting to 8 deep in the postseason, I don't think it's like 2010, 2011 deep. But I understand there's opportunities each side. And then again, like I said, if you're going into the different conversation of the regular season versus the NCAA tournament games, I'm going to put this chart back up there. So I think in the regular season, I can see it getting to 9 guys. Maybe the 9th guy is different each and every game. Maybe some games it's Zach Clemence if you want a little bit more size. Maybe some games it's Rakease Passmore. Maybe some games it's Flory Bidunga if Zach Clemence beats out Flory, and that's the case, right? I could see that kind of being the situation. But once we get to the NCAA tournament, that's out the window. And that's what I think is important here when we are discussing rotations. I do think you have to understand there's going to be a different rotation in the pre-conference season. There's going to be a tighter rotation in the conference season, and then there's going to be the tightest rotation in the postseason. I think in the pre-conference season, it'll be probably 9 guys pretty consistently. Once you get to conference season, it'll probably be some games where it's 9 and some where it's 8. And hell, maybe even some games where it's 7. And then once you get to the tournament time, I mean, if this ends up being a team that can play 9 deep in the regular season, it probably whittles down to closer to being like 8 deep in the NCAA tournament. But this is crazy to me. NCAA tournament games with players who played 10 or more minutes in the game, 52% of the tournament games under Bill Self, they've only played 7 guys, 10 or more minutes. 22% they've played 8. 17% they played 6. They have played 6 guys, 10 or more minutes in an NCAA tournament game under Bill Self. Almost triple the amount of times that they've played 9 guys. They have played only 5 guys, 10 or more minutes in an NCAA tournament game twice. They've played 9 guys 4 times. So once the tournament happens, get ready to whittle it down, because that conversation about, it could be this guy, this guy, and this guy, probably once it comes tournament time, it's like it's just Dajuan Harris, Rylan Griffen, Zeke Mayo, AJ Storr, KJ Adams, Hunter Dickinson, and maybe a backup big. Maybe an 8th guy gets spot minutes like Shakeel Moore, Rakease Passmore or something. I don't know. Maybe KJ just becomes your backup big for the tournament to whittle down the rotation, and that's one way to do it. But yeah, it'll get much tighter once that's the case. But again, going back to the idea of sometimes we play this dangerous game in the offseason, I want to get to that next on Locked On Jayhawks. Thanks for tuning in to Locked On Jayhawks. So next week, we are going to actually have our rotation predictions, where we will actually give you the minute-by-minute predictions, the starting lineup predictions, and everything of what I think it's going to be, at least before we get into, the kind of boot camp situation and some more off-season intel of what's kind of going on that can maybe steer where that's going to be a little bit more than the last. So we'll do that next week. This was just more of a introductory and kind of a research onto what Bill Self has done and to kind of guide what past history would tell us to do. But I do think there's this dangerous game that you can play in the offseason here. And I think we do it every offseason. And, some people do it more than others, and some people do it less than others. One thing to keep in mind is how we hype up every player to hit their potential in that given season during the offseason, right? So when we talk about, they have Flory Bidunga on the roster. Like last year, the example was, they have Elmarko Jackson, a McDonald's All-American, on the roster. And, I think you get enamored with the idea this kid's a McDonald's All-American. He could be a future NBA draft pick, but it might be 2 years, right? And for the case of some guys, like it does work out, right? You talk about like Grady Dick, like that worked out. And I think that's a great year to look at, honestly, with Grady Dick, because you had Grady Dick where it worked out great, ended up being a first-round draft pick, gave you all sorts of production. You also had MJ Rice, who just didn't really play for you. Couldn't really crack the rotation, And I think that's a good example of, it's almost sometimes like a coin flip with some of these guys of what you're going to get in year one. So it's easy to see it as like, Flory Bidunga, like he's going to be great. And we do this in reverse too, when we go back and look at like past loaded rosters that like, oh my gosh, they had this guy coming off the bench. You had Jeff Withey as your 5th big man. It's like, well, yes, because they were loaded. That is true. But also maybe Jeff Withey wasn't nearly as good as a second-year player as he was in year 4. You know what I mean? So it's a little bit of both. But sometimes we do that, and that can kind of taint our vision of this, because in reality, it's not going to happen. Not every player is going to hit their ceiling, their peak at the same time. So while it's easy to look at all these players as saying, okay, Zeke Mayo is going to be a perfect fit coming right over, and Shakeel Moore is going to be a perfect fit coming right over, and AJ Storr and Rylan Griffen are going to hit right away, and Rakease Passmore is going to overblow his recruiting ranking, and Flory Bidunga is going to show why he's a McDonald's All-American, and blah, blah, blah. Not all of that stuff is going to happen. And some of it's not going to happen because the competition, like somebody's going to beat out somebody else in competition, and maybe mentally that leads to you having a down year, or maybe you just don't get as many chances with Bill Self because the other guy beat you out and he wants to give that guy more of a run and opportunity. So I think just assume this, like, let's pick the full group that could be coming off a bench. I think in a down year, maybe one of them hit. Like, okay, if we're talking the starting 5 is, just for the sake of this, like, let's say Dajuan Harris, Rylan Griffen, AJ Storr, KJ Adams, Hunter Dickinson. At that point, your bench group would be Zeke Mayo, Shakeel Moore, Zach Clemence, Flory Bidunga, and Rakease Passmore. Right? I feel like Jamari McDowell redshirts here. That's the reason I haven't been bringing that name up. And then obviously Elmarko is taking like a medical redshirt. So that's a 5-player pool. In a down year, which I would consider like last year a down year for how this all worked together, maybe only one of them hit. And maybe only one of them hits to where you have a basically a 6-man rotation come the end of the year. In a normal year, maybe 2 to 3 of them hit. And you have a 7 to 8-man rotation. And then in a great year, 3 to 4 do hit, but it's not realistic for everybody to hit right away, or everybody to be reaching their ceiling, or everybody to be playing their peak basketball at the same point in time. So as much as it's easy to list those names and be like, yeah, you have Rakease Passmore and Zach Clemence and everything. Well, what if it does take Rakease Passmore another year to get ready, right? What if it isn't a perfect transition for Shakeel Moore right away? What if Flory Bidunga does need another year to kind of work with, or Zach Clemence isn't totally ready, right? We've heard before him being a good player in practice and all these things, but then once it's come game time, it hasn't, showed up on tape or in the stats or anything like that. So as much as you might be high on all these players, I would caution you, and it's not that you have to pick a specific one. Like, I don't know which one I would pick that might not live up to the potential this year. I almost just view it as like you're throwing darts, and of the 5 darts you throw off the bench, maybe you only expect 3 of them to connect. Maybe you only expect one of them to hit a triple 20, and one of them to hit a 17, and then one of them to just give you like a 10. And then the rest are going to be off the board or something. I don't know. But I do think those are important lessons to keep in mind before we get into our rotation projection, which we'll get to next week on Locked On Jayhawks. So make sure you subscribe to the show and catching us anywhere you get your podcasts, including on our YouTube page. We'll see you next time with LOJ.